Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Weller and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Today's topic is a review on the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Now I have coined it half a Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Now why have I done that? Well, because I think you got only half a Dungeon Master's Guide in this book. And let me explain. I know that sounds a bit strange, but there are lots of different reasons and I will spell them out. There is a reason I have never reviewed the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. It's the worst one that Wizards of the Coast has made in my opinion. They have made 4 to 6 Dungeon Master Guides now. They made one for version 3, version 3.5, there's actually 2 for version 4, and then version 4 actually had Dungeons & Dragons Essentials, and they made one there. And now, Dungeons & Dragons 5e, we have another Dungeon Master Guide. The Dungeon Master Guide is not really desirable enough as a book, and you could use older Dungeon Master Guides, or you could just access the free online Dungeon Master Guide, or use a range of online resources and get more out of it than this book in terms of dungeon mastering, in my opinion. The section on types of players and playing styles is very important. And it's actually incredibly small. It's incomplete as far as I'm concerned. Player styles is one of the most important aspects of a Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, why is that? Because it covers complex human behaviors, psychological motivations around playing Dungeons and Dragons, and if you don't have that there, then people are going to ask a lot of questions and they're not going to get them from a Dungeon Master's Guide, or certainly not this one. The world, city, town, and settlement building sections it's all been done before. It has not really ever had anything particularly useful in it, and this one, it doesn't really have anything this time round either, and I think that's quite unfortunate. There's a lot to be said for just providing Dungeon Masters with a generic area map or area maps. People can copy them or present them in some way in their game and just steal them in some way. That's the sort of thing that people want. Or just presenting a random name generator for a town, cities, taverns, inns, shops. That's not included. Now, I know some people are going to say, hang on, Fred, there is a tavern name generator, and it's not very big. It's like roll a d20. That's not good enough. You need to have something more. Otherwise, people are going to use an online app or a website. The section on creating a campaign is actually quite in-depth. Now, if you had provided people with a flow chart, that would have helped a lot because this section is quite complicated and you do need to have assistance when working with it. The multiverse information that is provided, it is essentially the section on the multiverse, and all it is a collection of Wizards of the Coast information or Dungeons & Dragons multiverse lore. That's it. It doesn't really explain to you how to build your own multiverse. That's, I think, what people really wanted. Now, they have included an idea of what their multiverse looks like. There's a picture in there, a map, and that's useful. But you need to give people sample maps to give them an idea of how to build a multiverse rather than pretty pictures. Pretty pictures don't help a lot. The adventure design section or information is very general. It has some good stuff amongst what I would say is some very boring sections, things that you don't really need. While the random adventure creation tables are there, I mean, you could use them. They're quite small, they're sparse on detail, they're very generic and extremely broad, and you wind up getting a very cryptic idea of what the adventure is. So that's not very helpful for a dungeon master because, one, Dungeon Masters don't make adventures randomly, but of course you don't have to roll dice. You could just exclude that and not worry about it. But what you do need is you do need to make sure they don't have to do a whole lot of additional work in terms of developing that particular adventure idea, and that doesn't do this here as far as I'm concerned. The combat encounter building section and the adventuring day guides, these are mathematical formulas that really have been repeated throughout history. In terms of the history of Wizards of the Coast, it's been nonsensical junk from the very time it was put out, which is version 3. And I don't find it very helpful in terms of actually constructing a combat encounter or trying to deal with the adventuring day. In fact, I think the concept of the adventuring day needs to be just ignored and consider it a silly idea in the first place. What about creating non-player characters? This is just not broad enough. There's not enough here. Where is the name generator? Okay, one of the things that Dungeon Masters need is they absolutely need to have a name generator. Otherwise, they're going to go and check stuff out on the internet, and that's what most people do. They don't use a Dungeon Master's Guide because there's no name generator there. Now, what sort of charts would help in terms of building non-player characters? It's been done before in third-party books. You need a percentile chart or table. That would make all the difference in this section. Why are there character subclasses in this book? Why is there an option for subclasses in a Dungeon Master's Guide? Other than to broaden the consumer appeal to people who aren't Dungeon Masters. I don't for a minute believe that the Cleric Death Domain or the Paladin Oathbreaker was intended only as a Dungeon Master's villainous mechanical feature section. No, I think it was put in there to get players to buy this particular book because players don't buy Dungeon Master's Guides. They will buy the Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual, but a Dungeon Master Guide they don't normally buy. So how do you get them to buy it? You put player options in there, and that's what they've done. And I give them a big thumbs down for that. There's a pathetic token gesture of sample traps compared to the past publications that Wizards of the Coast has put out. There's only a third of what there should be, and that really annoys me that there's only a third of the kinds of traps we have seen before in older Dungeon Master Guides, and they've only put in a third. That's not good enough. Now, what about downtime activities? This is exceptional content, and I have to say I could have done with more in-depth information. Make it broader, make it more in-depth. It is by far one of the gems of this book. But few Dungeon Masters are going to realize the full potential, unfortunately, because it's not broad enough, and because a lot of the tools in the Dungeon Master Guide don't really appeal to people, so they don't want to go and buy it, or even use it, even if they do buy it. The amount of space used for magic items is outrageous. I've heard people say this many times. I've thought it myself, but for the sake of trying to get players to buy the book, putting magic items in there will certainly do that. That will improve the sale of the Dungeon Master's Guide. That's not my problem as a Dungeon Master. That's Wizards of the Coast. I would like to say, though, that even though there's a large number of magic items in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it has been done before. It was done during the 3.5 era. Okay, version 3 Dungeon Master's Guide had a lot of magic items, and this is not a new idea. Magic items turn out to be probably one of the draw factors for a lot of players. They certainly will buy a Dungeon Master Guide for the magic items that are in there, so they know what they do. Magic items also turn out to be the most used section in the Dungeon Master Guide by Dungeon Masters as a reference tool. Now, there's a lot of different reasons behind this. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on it, other than to say it's not necessarily because that's what Dungeon Masters wanted in the Dungeon Master Guide, but because you usually don't write down all the information on a magic item in your notes. You just make a page reference to where to find it in the Dungeon Master Guide if it's already in an existing book. That's usually why it's often used by Dungeon Masters, particularly during their game rather than during preparation time. The guidance around skill checks is really poor. The difficulty class, or DC, is almost non-existent, which is something that Dungeon Masters always need and always ask for. Now, I have to say that there are some sections in there that do give you some charts and ideas around social interactions, foraging, exploration, that sort of stuff is there. There's a few more that give you some DCs and ideas how to do that, but nowhere near enough compared to what Dungeon Masters actually require from a Dungeon Master's Guide. And it's been done far better during 3.5 and version 4. So if they've done huge charts and given you that information in the past, why are they not doing it this time? It's not good enough to just give you a scale of 5 to 30, 5 being very easy, 10 being easy, 15 being medium, 20 is hard. very hard is 25, and 30 is near impossible. That's not enough. That's not enough guidance for a dungeon master. This book was meant to have a large range of optional rules that dungeon masters could use or players could use in the game, but it has a handful of variant rules with no pros or cons discussed usually. You'll find that there's really no in-depth information on those particular variant rules or optional rules. Why is that? Probably because they never got play tested, because the rule set and the monster manual came out so close to the time of the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's not nearly enough time. It would have taken them at least 2.5 years or 3 years to test all these variant rules. So it was probably a bad idea to advertise that this book was going to offer a lot of variant rules that dungeon masters could use, because you really wouldn't be able to test them. So let's not beat up on Wizards of the Coast with regard to that. There are no solutions offered for dealing with difficult problems from players. So problem players is not really discussed. And guess what? Dungeon master behavior. They don't talk about problem dungeon master behavior, or the sorts of things you might try to do and probably shouldn't do. That won't be a very healthy game. They don't discuss those sorts of things. Yet it has been in older dungeon master guides. We have seen it before, and that's not in this book. Why not? Because probably trying to save on space. Running out of space, where do we put it? Just leave it out, okay? As a result, we wind up with a lot of content that should have been in the Dungeon Master's Guide being released in supplements years later. Frequently asked questions around character death are omitted. This is one of the really important things we really needed to have in this book, which has in fact been in older books. Now, why do we need to talk about character death in a Dungeon Master Guide? Well, because it's usually an emotionally charged major event for some players, and you do need to go and deal with that in some way in a Dungeon Master Guide, because they will ask questions, and if you don't have answers, they've got to go somewhere else. What about creating from scratch monsters, spells, magic items, races, classes, well, gosh, backgrounds? There is some very significant tools here. But here's the problem. It's been poorly executed in the past in older Dungeon Master Guides, and they've done the same thing here. Except for 2 situations. The magic item creation stuff is fantastic, but it's separated. It's actually in 2 different locations. It should have been in the same place. Now, when it comes to building your own monsters, the kind of guidance they give you is really good, and it's pretty much all in one place. I've used it many times. It's an excellent tool. Monster features, something like the Monster Quick Build is great. The Monster Item Special Features is awesome. The Magic Item History, Quirks, Properties tables, all inspiring stuff. Very, very good. But still not extensive enough. A lot of those tables and charts are just not big enough to be useful over time. Otherwise, you wind up making the Dungeon Master Guide only a beginner Dungeon Master book. Monster challenge rating calculations and adjustments and formulas, yet again, pretty much pointless. Now, we're talking about challenge rating. I've never had a particularly good opinion of challenge rating, and probably everybody else feels pretty much the same way. So that section is kind of, a wasted space. But there are people who want it there, and it's there. The appendix has pretty solid tools. There's a random dungeon table. There are lists of monsters by environment. There are lists of monsters by challenge rating. And there is a Dungeon Master inspiration book reading list. Those are really good sections. I'm really happy they put that there. The problem with random generated tables for dungeons is that dungeon masters don't build dungeons randomly. But it's very comprehensive in terms of a list of locations, traps, furniture, and decorations or decor that you might want to put into your dungeon, including things that people could find. It would have been smart to include some specific historical descriptions around the different dungeon rooms listed in the random room tables. Now, if they've done that, it would have saved a lot of people from jumping on the internet and doing their own research. That could have been the deciding factor in terms of that section. It's a shame that none of the sample maps, and I think the idea of having sample maps is definitely excellent, but most of them are not going to be used by dungeon masters because they're just generally not frequently used locations. The kinds of maps that dungeon masters needed as sample maps would have been something like a campsite, tavern, a shop, inn. Let's go on to something like a castle, a standard castle, not some weird wacky thing that doesn't make any sense. A crypt, tombs, mines are usually constructed the same way, and a vertical mine map would have been fantastic. I would have loved to see something like that. Or a monster lair, just the lair section. Those would have been the deciding factors for me in terms of sample maps. There is a very reasonable index to find information in a book, which is rare to see in a Wizards of the Coast book. Wizards of the Coast don't really put indexes in their books, and it's a silly thing to do, but it's still difficult to find specific information even when you use the table of contents and the index, as a result of the fact that a lot of the information is just small paragraphs of information sometimes, so you can't find it. And even if you're not sure it's there, you still probably can't find it. And if you won't even know if a really useful piece of information's in there because it's not laid out particularly well anyway. So that's half your problem there. But they do have an index. A Dungeon Master's Guide with lots of pretty artistic pictures rather than sample maps or example maps that are generic enough that people can keep using is poorly conceived. There needed to be common locations, maps that people could use or steal in their games, and that would have significantly improved the chances of a dungeon master using this book. And they didn't do that, and I wish they had. The only reason I would say to actually use this book over using an older Dungeon Master's Guide is because it has the magic items, it has some variant rules in it, and it has Dungeons & Dragons 5e specific mechanics in the game, okay, that you would probably want to have information on, but a lot of that you can probably find somewhere else. Now, here's the problem with a Dungeon Master Guide, and this is the biggest issue they have. When you make a Dungeon Master Guide, it must lift the quality tools bar much higher each time you put out an edition. Every time you put out a new game, you must make the Dungeon Master Guide significantly better than it was before, or it becomes obsolete, literally no use to you. And that's what actually happened with this book. This is partly due to poor book design, because they have taken older sections from older Dungeon Master Guides and they've just reprinted them, maybe changed a few words around, and that's it. So there's a lot of reprinting. Poor design, reprinting the same old material from an older Dungeon Master Guide does not give you points. And on top of that, they are unfortunately in the time of the digital age. So now online digital resources are available. So do you really need to have a Dungeon Master Guide? I think you might find that as a result of this, we're going to wind up seeing Dungeon Master Guides needing to be something completely different. I also want to point out, and I know a lot of people talk about the fact that it's got lots of charts in it. Many of those tables and charts are very small. The biggest dice you're probably going to roll is a D20, which is just not enough options. They're quite primitive. They're sparse on information and details. And that's a big problem. You must give people 100 options. Don't give them 20 options, give them 100 options. I think what would have been smarter would be to include in the Dungeon Master Guide a link to an online resource that Wizards of the Coast is fielding. Or what about giving us access to the original spreadsheet that they used for building encounters and monsters and all that sort of stuff? That would have been fantastic. I think the future of a Dungeon Master Guide will have to be in book form and in digital form. It's going to have to be a bit of both, otherwise it's just not useful to anybody. Now, I am hoping that you found this useful. I know that seems like I'm beating up on this book, but it's not the book I would recommend people buy. So when I do this book review, I'm not even suggesting that you go and buy it. There are better books out there than this thing, and you can use a lot of the tools online rather than use this book. But if you did find it useful, fantastic. I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters you are welcome to go and check out. If you want to support the channel, you can through Patreon, the Amazon affiliate links down in the description, the merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos, or just keep watching my videos, that's fine. Make sure to share, like, and subscribe, hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.